Hey everyone, it's Zack Beck. Multinational corporations often pay little to no tax, thanks in large part to the current system we have in place. However, a recent agreement by the Group of Seven aims to change that. They are looking to institute a global minimum tax at 15%. This will have a dramatic impact on not only the cost of goods, but also the profits of these various corporations that we invest in. So what I want to do in this video is break down in detail what the global minimum tax is, who it actually applies to, and also how it will impact you and I from a financial perspective so we can plan accordingly to come out of the other side ahead. So let's take our time, dive in the details, jump into it right now. As previously mentioned, the Group of Seven agreed to implement a global minimum tax at 15%. Now, the Group of Seven consists of the world's major economies, including the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, Italy, Japan, and Germany. And they've come together to agree upon this basic threshold at 15% for multinational corporations to pay taxes. Now, this is a watershed moment as we currently do not have a system in place right now. However, there are limitations moving forward as to how this could be implemented because we have all these other countries throughout the world who actually have lower tax rates that they currently offer. You might think of countries such as Ireland, or you might think of places in the Cayman Islands where people store their money. So this is going to require some work, but that 15% minimum threshold will be substantial in regards to setting a baseline for corporations to operate with. This proposal was put forward by the Biden administration, and specifically Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen attended this meeting of the Group of Seven to advocate on its behalf. Now, the Biden administration initially came in recommending a 21% global minimum tax, but the other countries negotiated and brought it down to 15%. Now, just so we understand what this would mean, is that the intention behind this, according to Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen, she says that this is to prevent a race to the bottom, in her words. And what she means by that is various countries will lower their corporate tax rate in order to lure corporations to headquarter or incorporate there. And what they do in essence is that these corporations will go to these low tax countries and then they incorporate there, but then they conduct the majority of their business elsewhere, and then they don't pay taxes in those other countries. So from that standpoint, this is where you hear the term of maybe offshoring your profits. And what we're looking at in this respect is trying to establish a global minimum tax so that we have a baseline threshold that no matter where any of these corporations incorporate, whether they're in Ireland, France, the United States, or somewhere in Latin America or anything to that extent, that hopefully they would be able to pay a baseline minimum tax. Now, I'm not here to tell you that this is a good or a bad thing. It is just the agreement that came to fruition. Now, one thing to bear in mind as well is that just because the Group of Seven has agreed to this doesn't mean that the entire world is going to agree to this. Furthermore, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has to meet and actually come to a baseline agreement to actually make this become effective. Because if just the Group of Seven establishes this 15% minimum tax threshold, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone else is going to follow suit. So from that standpoint alone, there's still a lot of work to be done. But what you might be considering is, what does this actually mean for you or myself when it comes to these different corporations? Because quite frankly, a lot of us as investors invest in multinational corporations. So one thing that we can look at is how those various corporations have already responded to this, and actually the responses have been relatively surprising. For example, the VP of Global Affairs for Facebook actually put out a statement saying that he was very supportive of this and said that Facebook wants to have established a global minimum tax. In addition, representatives from Amazon have issued support, even Google has issued support. So from that standpoint alone, it appears as though these larger corporations are actually wanting to have a baseline, so that way they're not having to figure out these various tax thresholds when they're trying to figure out the way moving forward. Now, we could take the optimistic approach and say, wow, well, that's really cool. These large corporations are totally fine with that, so it's not going to have that big of an impact. But the one thing we really need to take a look at on a deeper level is understanding that a lot of these tech corporations are established in the United States, and really since the 1980s until 2017, we had a corporate tax rate in the United States that was very high. It was like 35%. Then according to the US Jobs and Tax Act that was put into place back in 2017, that actually lowered the tax threshold in the United States to 21%. And what we had was President Biden requesting to actually increase the corporate tax rate here in the United States to a higher place, back either to 35% or maybe in the 28% threshold. But because of negotiations that have been transpiring here in America when it comes to infrastructure and other elements, he has not been able to receive support for raising the corporate minimum tax here in the United States. So that's going to remain at 21%. So if you think about it, if corporations are paying 21% here in America, but then other European nations or other global entities are offering it at 15%, it is effectively going to be more affordable for these corporations to go elsewhere still. So even though we might find that this establishes a global minimum, if the United States is still higher than these other countries, those corporations are going to go to the other countries. So it's really interesting to see what's going on here. It might even be an impetus for the United States to consider lowering our overall corporate tax rate down to 15%. Now, we also are going to see that other countries do have higher taxes than us, such as France, so you might find that these corporations aren't going to go there, but we are going to see an interesting dynamic transpire that if this does become law, where these different corporations are going to land, because ultimately they're going to have to make a decision that works best for their bottom line and for their shareholders. So you might be asking yourself, how is this going to impact me personally? And from that standpoint, there are some things that we need to take into consideration. Oftentimes, when you have higher taxes and regulations or fees on different corporations, what oftentimes happens is that those fees are then passed down to consumers. So if we have higher taxes on these various corporations, it's likely that they will then raise their prices in order to cover that difference. Now, it's not necessarily going to be the case for every single entity, because in a capitalistic society, we often have a lot of competition transpiring between different companies, so therefore they're still trying to get your business, even if they have to lower their prices a little bit. But generally, the more expensive it is for a business to operate, oftentimes those various fees and those taxes are generally passed down to the consumer. So we could potentially see prices increase as a result of this. In addition, when you think about the overall inflation concerns that are happening right now, as we're seeing in the marketplace right now with supply chain issues, as well as the government printing and spending so much money, we're already seeing prices start to increase. So if a global minimum tax is tacked on top of that, we could see that expedited even further. So from that standpoint alone, we might see prices increase, but we have to think about the actual timeline for this to be implemented. One thing you could consider is, like I mentioned previously, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development still has to agree to this in order for this to actually become effective, and then it has to go back to the various legislatures in these different countries to agree to it as well. And just getting that passed in the United States Congress would be very difficult, let alone what's happening in Lithuania or what's happening in France or Italy or the UK or Brazil or wherever any other country is trying to do this. It's going to be difficult. Therefore, the actual implementation of this could be years down the road. So from that standpoint alone, that is something for us to have with a little bit more of an optimistic viewpoint, that maybe this won't have as dramatic of an effect on prices right now, but the group of 7 could just agree to it themselves and set that 15% threshold, but then you'd find other countries might undercut them, and then you'd see the corporations maybe gravitate in that direction. As I was researching this, I actually found the flowchart that was put together to show how the taxes would be calculated and how it actually work, and I can tell you it is very complex. And the more complex the system is, the more likely it is that various tax attorneys and organizations can find a way to carve out loopholes or establish situations where in which they will be able to bypass the system and actually benefit from it. So just like we have our US tax code, which is extremely complex, and there are various loopholes, I already see that potentially coming to fruition here. So generally the companies that are going to benefit the most from this type of tax situation are the largest corporations, because they can pay the tax attorneys and the people to do forensic audits to find the way that they're going to benefit from it. And who's going to get hurt the most are generally the lower corporations and smaller companies that don't have that level of finance to be able to go through the system. So from that standpoint alone, it is a bit uncertain as to how this is going to impact prices moving forward, but I would say the likelihood of if this actually did become law, it would probably lead to slightly higher prices for us as consumers. Now you might be wondering if this is going to impact you as an investor. Now the early indication so far is that the stock market has responded positively to this development, even surprising to a lot of people. And from that standpoint alone, it's important for us to maybe look at some specific companies. For example, NVIDIA only paid a 2.6% corporate tax rate over the last year. So one would think that their shares would actually start to go down in price, because if they're going to pay a 15% tax, that's going to cut into their profits. But so far, that company hasn't responded at all in that respect. As a matter of fact, their stock price has started to increase. So what we're seeing right now is, I believe a lot of these corporations understand the complexity of the political situation going on right now, and if this were to actually become law in the years to come, it wouldn't really be that substantial, because if they're looking to go anywhere other than the United States, 15% is still a reasonable rate. So from that standpoint alone, I don't think this is going to impact us as investors as substantially as we might be concerned that it could. So I think that's a good indication for us that even if this does become law, we should be okay to continue moving forward. And like I always always say when it comes to investing, I prefer not just going after individual corporations or individual companies because of the risk of volatility associated with that. I generally prefer going with broader index funds. And what we would find is that if you go with an index fund, you're really kind of hedging your bet a little bit more effectively. And that way, if certain corporations are unable to respond positively to this tax rate, you're not going to be that impacted, whereas others are going to be able to navigate through it, and they should continue to move forward. So if you have like an S&P 500 index, that's a really good way of doing that. And if you actually want to check one of those out, you can try the link I have in the description for Wealthfront. That's a really effective way to kind of get started investing in index funds. So a quick recap, the Biden administration proposed a global minimum tax at 15% that was brought to the Group of Seven. The Group of Seven then agreed to it, and now it's moving forward to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. If that is agreed to by that large body of countries, then we could actually see this become law. If it does become law, then corporations would be required to pay 15% as a global minimum tax, irrespective of wherever they incorporate or where their headquarters are located. And that would establish a baseline for every country to operate with. Some countries could then have a higher minimum tax. So for example, the United States would have their 21%, or you might have countries that have potentially something a little higher than that, but no one would go lower than 15%, preventing us from ever having a race down to 0%. In addition, we're seeing so far the stock market has responded positively to that, so we can take a bit of a deep breath. And furthermore, we might see potential price increases, but the way this would be implemented down the road, it really wouldn't be too different than what we're already seeing with subtle inflation. So overall, it's something that could come to fruition and actually become law, or we might stick with the same system right now where various countries have various approaches and corporations go wherever is most effective for them. So for you and myself as investors and just as individuals interested in personal finance, I think the same approach applies that we're always looking to do. Just do everything you can in your personal life to save money, to cut spending, to avoid lifestyle inflation, avoid debt, and then invest strategically into the stock market, into index funds, just that way you're taking care of your business and you don't have to be as concerned with what is going on with all these different corporations, all these different countries, all these finance ministers who are trying to come up with systems that are going to work for them. Because quite frankly, that level of complexity and depth is so complicated and nuanced that it's not really going to impact you or I directly unless we make irrational decisions based off of that type of news. So if we stay level-headed and continue with our own plan and make wise decisions for ourselves, then you're going to be successful financially moving forward. And that's the most important thing. So you can provide for your family, you can achieve your goals, you can do everything you can to live a life of meaning and purpose while maintaining balance and moderation. With all that being said, I'd like to thank you for watching the video today. If you wouldn't mind, please tap the like button for the YouTube algorithm. Help push this video to other people who might need to hear it. Furthermore, if you have any questions, please comment down below. I'd love to interact with you, get to know you, do any research on your behalf, and help you make well and wise informed decisions moving forward. Furthermore, if you wouldn't mind, please subscribe to the channel. That would mean a lot to myself personally, as I do everything I can to create positive content that has a positive impact in your life by encouraging you and myself to lead lives of meaning and purpose, all while maintaining balance and moderation. And if you do subscribe to the channel, please tap the notification bell. That will notify you every time I post a video, which I do on a weekly basis. Once again, I'd like to thank you for watching the video today. I hope you have a wonderful day. Talk to you next time.